I'm Chris Farrell, and this is On Watch. Welcome to On Watch, everybody, the Judicial Watch podcast, where we go behind the headlines to cover news and information the mainstream media probably doesn't want you to know about, where we try to recover some lost history and explain the inexplicable. Today, it's history, and we're going to dive into an outstanding new book that's just come out called To Overthrow the World, and we are very fortunate to have the author of To Overthrow the World, Sean McMeekin, joining us. Welcome, Sean.
Well, thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me on. It's great to be here.
We really appreciate you taking time to talk to us. The subtitle of your book, very interestingly, is The Rise and Fall and Rise of Communism. Wonderfully provocative title. It suggests that all 1991 was not a happy ending, that there was more to communism. Give us the backstory to your very interesting subtitle.
Well, I can't take credit for the subtitle. It was actually my publisher's idea, so I have to give credit to Laura Heinrich for that. I mean, she obviously got it out of reading the book, and so to some extent, the book gave the inspiration to the title. I guess there's a little bit of a kind of one hopes a virtuous cycle going on there, but it was actually her title. But it definitely grew right out of the book, and it made a lot of sense because that's both where I kind of start and where I end the book. Is talking about the disappointment many of us have felt or experienced over the past few decades. We all thought there was this euphoric moment, whether we're talking about the fall of the Berlin Wall or maybe Yeltsin bellowing on the tank in 1991 and staring down the anti-democratic, anti-constitutional coup d'etat, as they called it, of the unreconstructed communists of the Soviet Union. And even maybe a decade or so later, when it seemed like we were at this kind of peak moment of American unilateralism, hegemony, or at the very least, well, one might even call it arrogance. I mean, this hubris that had maybe set in. And I mentioned the Richard Pipes quote. I mean, much as I revere his work, I think probably it was not maybe his finest moment when he said in this short little history of communism that he wrote, which is probably not his best work. He wrote some much more serious books, that he was writing the obituary of communism. It seems to be a bit premature. I mean, both in the obvious sense, and I suppose that it's working both in the obvious sense. We still have communist regimes around the world, maybe not as many as there used to be, but there's China, most obviously, North Korea. We have Laos, Vietnam. Cuba's kind of in this slightly different category where, even in the Cold War, they were officially non-aligned, but actually a communist country. And then even Cambodia, although they brought back the monarchy. Effectively, the communists are still in power there. But I think more than that, and maybe what I'm hinting at in the title is that, unfortunately, I don't think communism and communists are completely done with us. I mean, we saw this most obviously, and I suppose this is really where I got the inspiration for the book from, a couple of years ago with the COVID lockdowns, which were literally and directly imported from China. I mean, there's even this amazing line. Neil Ferguson, I should preface by saying this is not Neil Ferguson, the Scottish historian at the Hoover Institute. We're talking about. He's spelled with an N-I-A-L-L. I'm talking about the N-E-I-L of Neil Ferguson, the famous scaremonger epidemiologist who had these charts about COVID deaths and helped convince Britain and the U.S. and most of their allies to shut down. He even said at one point they didn't think they could get away with this because, after all, the Chinese did it, but that's a communist country, and we didn't think we could get away with it in the West. And then Italy showed us we could. And so then we did, and they did, and they imported everything from shutting down businesses to social controls, quarantining of the healthy population. What was that if not communism? It was a variant of it. I mean, maybe it was slightly different than what we might have seen under Stalin and Mao. In some ways, maybe not as onerous. In other ways, frankly, worse. I mean, I don't remember the quarantining of the entire healthy population of either China or the Soviet Union. I mean, that was kind of unprecedented in some ways. So that's really where I have to give credit to a historian called Nick Lloyd. He's also the one who kind of told me I should write this book. We were having this conversation at the height of the lockdowns. And he said, why don't you just write a history of communism? So that's what I did.
And you've done it masterfully. I think one of the great things, so you're an academic. You are a history professor at Bard College. And that's really your background, besides writing fantastic history books. And I can recommend to our viewers and listeners all of them. Stalin's War was the last book you did before this. It's a great perspective of World War II, using Stalin as the central figure. We've had endless histories of World War II done But you've taken and put the focus from the Soviet, particularly Stalin himself, the man, that point of view, which is an excellent treatment of the war that you don't see elsewhere. But so for some of our viewers and listeners, they may say, "Oh no, an academic, some history professor, it's not going to be accessible. It's not going to be a popular history." And let me put any concerns you have to rest. This is a very accessible, very entertaining, engaging book, as is all your writing, frankly. So, no, it is. I mean, it's some guys, it's dry as dust, unfortunately, and that's a disservice to history. But you've done great work to really make it intriguing and kind of, it's like, not like you're reading a novel in the sense that it's frivolous, but it's very engaging and it keeps people motivated to move through the story. So what I wanted to discuss was how you kind of set the book up. It's in parts. So you run a history in the sense of literally giving examples of sort of utopian societies and how we arrive at Marx, really. So there's the theory behind communism, and then how communism is practiced, right? There's different flavors of it, and you walk through those. And then you come to really what I think is a very powerful epilogue, and you touched on it briefly there, is, well, how is communism manifest today? And it's manifest today with COVID. It's manifest today with social media and censorship and dis, and malinformation agencies controlling things. In my view, that's a totalitarian tactic. I just want to, let me kind of start in reverse. Marx and many of the early communists said that communism could only be realized, could only be effected through violent revolution. And that may have been true at one point, but I don't think it's true today. What's your take on that?
Well, I think you're onto something there. I mean, when I'm asked to define communism, there are different ways of defining, and there's often this idea that there's this kind of static dictionary definition. You have the state ownership of the means of production, the abolition of private property, centralization of banking. A lot of this comes right from Marx's Manifesto of the Communist Party, published in 1848. And so you could go around the world today and you could say, well, China doesn't fulfill every single one of these criteria, or you could say communism either is this or is that. The fact is it has changed over time. You hit on something that, at least in its earlier incarnations, it did require violence. So that while you might have seen elements of the kind of critique of inequality and everyone from Plato to Rousseau, or ideas about charity, material renunciation, exaltation of the poor in early Christianity, it's not until you got both, I think, Gracchus Babeuf's conspiracy of the equals, as usually called in the French Revolution, which directly inspired Marx, that you had this more activist program where it's not just that they thought inequality was bad and that they wanted social relations to be fair and for people to share their wealth or to renounce their wealth. Rather, they're actually trying to upend the entire social order, overthrow it radically by force, overturn it all root and branch. And what's interesting about these radicals, or these revolutionaries, like Babeuf himself, like Marx, later like Lenin and Stalin, is that they're not shy about the violence. Babeuf was quite clear that they would absolutely need to kill lots of people, that they would divide up into friend and foe. You'd have the Babeuvists, and they had various labels for them, the equals, all these other different names for them, and then their enemies would be basically written out of the community. They could be executed, they could be tortured, whatever you needed to do to them.
Yeah, this radical egalitarianism, I mean, really seeks a social leveling that is, you bulldoze society.
Right.
It's a very aggressive. This is not something that's sort of managed and put into a government program. This is something that is proactively, viciously imposed on the population. Right. And I think
you have to take everything, and then I guess you're supposed to share it out. And they literally talk about public warehouses, storehouses. The idea is somehow, and obviously in practice is virtually impossible, but somehow they're going to seize all of the food and the grain and the production, all of the factories all of the small-scale artisanal manufacturing facilities. They'll seize it all, and somehow this new class of course, Marx had his phrase proletarians, class of the oppressed, the class of the righteous, various ways it's defined, would supposedly ensure that they would be able to distribute all of this equally. Of course, as the more perceptive critics realized, I mean, in France, they just realized immediately this is sedition, and they arrested him, and they arrested his followers, and they executed many of them, put them on trial. In Marx's case, it was interesting, though he never really got that close to achieving power himself. He had critics who already saw both the way he was behaving and also the way he was responding to events. People like Bakunin, this early anarchist, who said, look, this vision is going to produce the most grotesque tyranny we've ever seen, because you might call yourself and your followers proletarians, even though Marx himself, of course, was kind of this bourgeois, really a déclassé bourgeois intellectual.
And I love your description of his upbringing and his personal circumstances and his time at university and his home in the UK, all of which sort of reeks of everything that he's supposedly fighting, right? I mean,
he
those
even hires
details don't get in the way.
to make sure that they don't have to do any housework and all the rest of it, even though he's always sponging money off of other people. It's really extraordinary. But so what Bakunin realized about this vision was that no matter where you ended up, simply to get there you needed violence, and then wherever you ended up, you would end up with this new hierarchy, but effectively a kind of tyrannical philosopher king types who would be ruling over the masses. That is to say, Marx's so-called proletarians would no longer be proletarians. But they did. You're absolutely right about the violence. They did not shy away from it at all. So when Marx talked about Paris Commune, for example, this short-lived regime that comes into place in Paris in the wake of the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, when people started criticizing it, both because it was pretty messy, and there were deaths, and they took hostages, and eventually everyone kind of knew the whole thing was going to end in this bloody failure. Even as it was being crushed, he started embracing. Even after it was crushed, even after they sent women and even in some cases children out into battle to be slaughtered, and they burned down buildings and they executed hostages, he didn't say, "Oh no, that's not what I meant." No, he said, "That's exactly what I meant." And the more bloodshed, the better, and that's the way we're going to make the revolution. And so people like Lenin, I think, intuitively understood this. There was always this idea that, oh well, Lenin had these slightly unorthodox ideas like Stalin, and they were violent, and so that means they weren't Marxist. No, absolutely not. Marx was quite clear that you would have to put the class enemies to death, and he was maybe not clear on where eventually you'd end up, but it was this process that required violence, political violence, cleansing violence. And Lenin, in fact, I mean, he took it in some ways even further than Marx. I think Marx would have approved of the general concept. I don't know if he would have elaborated with quite the same gusto that Lenin and Stalin did. I mean, Lenin, for example, in the military program of the Proletarian Revolution in 1916, he's already in the middle of the First World War, but before he comes to power in Russia, he's basically saying, like, look, if one of our countries loses the war, that's great. We'll turn the war into an even bloodier civil war, and hopefully we'll win that. But meanwhile, if we do win that, then the other countries will still not be communist, and so they'll be at war with us. And so eventually we'll be at war with some or all of them, and some of them will be communist, and then we'll all fight the capitalist powers. And basically it's just this unending series of wars and death and destruction and mayhem and violence. And that's what he wanted. That's what he was advocating for. And this is the world that we're going to create.
That is a particularly perverse but very intriguing aspect of Lenin's thinking with this revolutionary defeatism.
Yeah.
I mean, this idea that you actually want to, you're encouraging or you're developing the conditions for a defeat of your own, so that you can then take that and sort of jujitsu, right? Use the energy of the moment back to further advance the revolution.
Right.
It's a very, it's perverse. I mean, it's logical in a bizarre way, but you have to think about how is it that you would wish defeat on yourself and your countrymen in order to take the pain and suffering of that defeat and use it for revolutionary purposes. You have to be utterly ruthless to do that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the really sad thing is that it worked in many cases. There was a real insight there. And of course, from Lenin's perspective or Marx's perspective, these are not your fellow countrymen, or there's no such thing as country, right? So there's no such thing as France or Germany. The workers everywhere should band together with all the other workers. It's just that accidentally, maybe one country in the World War, the imperialist war as Lenin called it, might be a little weaker. It'd be a weak link in the chain. And if it happened to be your own country, then all the better, because that would give you a chance then to piggyback on that, to proselytize the armies with your doctrines, to preach effectively mutiny, defeatism, and then eventually you lynch your officers, and this spirals into this kind of internecine struggle, the civil war, basically, as he called it, from turning the imperialist war into civil war. And so it could work, and even if it didn't happen precisely like that in all countries, the broader insight is that it's only when these modern states have both mobilized millions of armed young men, but then also, unfortunately, fought in wars that started to destroy and devastate the social landscape. It's only in such situations like that that the communists could ever sniff power. And so, in that sense, war was not a bad thing. And, there were some socialists with a conscience, and maybe this is one of the things, we talk about definitions. Again, it's not always the exact same thing, but one of the things that tended to distinguish the communists from the socialists temperamentally. And after the First World War, when Lenin created the Communist International, the socialists who didn't want to join it, they actually had their own international, which in shorthand came to be called, oddly enough, the Second and a Half International, because Marx's was the third. But so the thing that distinguished the communists temperamentally, in part just a ruthlessness or a logical extremism of just pursuing ideas to their logical conclusion, but it was also just this idea that basically any squeamishness about violence must be sort of purged from your soul. That in order to achieve the revolution, you have to be willing to shoot and kill and maim lots of people. And there were a lot of socialists, to their credit, who kind of saw where that was going. And sure, maybe they're rationalizing and saying, I didn't really mean the thing about, the workers having a homeland and all that. Like, I kind of thought that maybe. But, the problem is, like, later on they would say, Lenin hijacked the movement. Well, no, Lenin just showed you where the ideas would actually go if you took them to their logical conclusion. Right. And some squeamish people shied away, and some of them would later, of course, repudiate communism. In fact, a lot of the best, you might say, anti-communist thinkers tend to be ex-communists because they were the ones who kind of understood the ideas the best. Yeah,
and then there's still an element today that, in certain circles still romance the idea of, communism is great. They'll dismiss the gruesome facts you've detailed in your book, and they'll say, they just didn't do it right. Come on, we need another shot at it. We need
communism. It's still out there.
Another chance. Yeah. And if we just design it and tinker with it, and if we just align it correctly, it'll be beautiful. And all these abuses and all these excesses and all the bloodshed and brutality, we really don't need to go there. Is there any example where that's true? I don't think so.
Well, no, I don't think there is, although I suppose to give some credit to the more intelligent communists that we've seen in power. Some of them realized maybe not that, let's say, the violence was wrong, but that, let's say, central planning in the end might not have been the most efficient path to creating, again, we're talking about either a utopia, but also just more prosperity or more economic growth. I mean, it's amazing that the CIA actually used to think this probably more emphatically than anyone else, that planning worked, that the Soviets were going to overtake us. Mao talked about this. We will in Mao's case, oddly enough, he was mostly talking back in the 50s about overtaking Britain. Oddly enough, he didn't quite think he could get to the U.S. level yet, but he thought that might happen eventually. Yeah. But in the case of Khrushchev, we will bury you, all this other rhetoric. Oddly enough, he was mostly talking about the economic competition, kind of, we will outproduce you in milk and corn and meat and all of those things. I think eventually reality set in, just to the extent that the more intelligent communists, at least in the Soviet Union and certainly in Eastern Europe, although they weren't fully really sovereign anyway, they had to go along with the Soviet line usually. So the Soviet ones mattered a little more. And certainly by the Gorbachev era, there was this notion that, look, we might need to tinker just a little bit. But again, it was not tinkering with the essential concept of single-party rule. They wanted the party still to be in charge, still to be planning, but they wanted the plan to be more supple. And maybe you could bring in certain market incentives. Maybe you could, one of Gorbachev's big ideas was quality control, the so-called Gospriemka. We will reject inferior goods. It turned out in the consumer sector, virtually all of them were inferior. And so the vast majority of them had to be rejected. They realized, actually, we're not very good at producing all these things. But what the real exception to the rule, and I think the thing that in the end, it's not that the communists were bad at everything. Just oddly enough, in the few areas in which they had to actually face market competition, such as in weapons production and exports, they actually were able to produce serviceable goods, in some cases even very sellable goods, like the AK-47 maybe being the most famous example of this. Yeah. That is to say, when they actually had to build something where consumers, in this case foreign governments, could reject it, they would actually do a little bit better. And oddly enough, I mean, one of the surprising things that I discovered in my research was that despite the obvious failures of even Gorbachev's signature economic reforms, quality control, the so-called perestroika, the cooperatives, and all the rest of it, there was no great improvement in the consumer sector and overall standard of living in the Soviet Union. However, in the military-industrial sector, they actually did pretty well. In fact, they were even outproducing the U.S. by the late 1980s. I actually think this is one of the reasons why, again, I think we were kind of fooled about the fall of communism, that it was all because the people rose up and everyone realized the ideas, well, people didn't really believe in them. Is that I think the Soviets, with clever leadership on Gorbachev's part, could have actually survived. That is, the regime could have survived. They were certainly well armed enough to do so. I think Gorbachev made a series of decisions of very, very catastrophic blunders. And the biggest of them all, of course, just unlike at Tiananmen Square, although he was willing to He was willing to shed blood. He was willing, in the end, maybe not to shed enough of it or for it to be targeted enough. And he was not paying close enough attention to what was going on in the KGB, the upper ranks of the officer corps. For example, the people in the KGB were famously spiriting money out of the Soviet Union. Now, there was a lot of money there that the government probably could have used had they been also a little clever, more subtle. I mean, in some ways, you look back at this now, and the people who are in the KGB in the 70s and 80s must be kicking themselves, thinking, why didn't we come up with something like social media so that the people will just share their thoughts with us? But we won't even have to torture them or spy on them or bribe them. We can just ask them to tell us what they're thinking, and they will share it with us. Had they thought about it in that way, or they realized that those things were possible, they were falling behind in IT, so I suppose that's part of the reason they didn't. But it was an interesting kind of a counterfactual to think about. Had they had the tools at their hand that either China's government today or even the U.S. or other Western governments have, I think they could have very easily seen off whatever threats they were facing back in the 1980s. I
think it's very interesting, as I was reading in the epilogue, discussing August of 91 and what Yeltsin was going through. And I can recall the day that all that came to a climax in Moscow, standing on the tank and all that, was the day that I assumed command of the Army's surveillance team in Frankfurt, Germany. And we were doing mostly counterespionage work. And it's very curious to me that how the United States approached the collapse and sort of reinvention of Russia over the collapse of the Soviet Union was that they were very tentative and very afraid, very cautious. There's the Gorbachev-Bush meeting in Malta, and Gorbachev basically says, okay, we quit, you win, and Bush goes, oh, no. we don't want you to actually say, you win, we quit, that's it. Which, that is remarkable. This guy, Gorbachev's willing to make the open admission that, the Cold War is over, communism has failed, and you guys win, we lose. And Bush,
he begged to surrender. He just wanted money in exchange.
Right, and Bush says, no, we need status quo. We need everything to remain exactly as it is. That's extraordinary. And then a personal anecdote, it's later on, it's probably 93, somewhere around there, and I was in a unit that was busy running double agent operations at the time, and suddenly nobody was interested in anything. We were dreaming up operational concepts to run agents, and virtually every proposal we were told, no, stop, slow down, don't do anything. Because the entire, I think, intelligence apparatus and certainly the administration just didn't want to provoke anybody to do anything. I mean, here it is. We finally win. We get to kind of make the most of it. And the answer is stop. Don't do anything.
Yeah. I mean, there are all kinds of missed opportunities going back to this period. And I think both of commission and omission. I mean, you look at something such as NATO expansion, which is a huge subject. I don't think we want to necessarily get too deeply into. But, we had this opportunity, obviously, to treat Russia more like again, Gorbachev was trying to surrender. We didn't want to let him surrender. Right. I mean, even when it came to Germany, I mean, the price was so small. Basically, the Germans offered to help pay some of the transit costs, and they helped to pay for apartments for the departing soldiers back in Russia. I mean, this is the most astonishing victory imaginable. And I saw that line. It was amazing when Gorbachev was trying to get Bush just to play ball, saying, well, look, my generals are saying I surrendered, the central piece of the chessboard for Deutschemarks, and now they're kind of starting to say I'm surrendering the Cold War for dollars. I am surrendering, but could I at least have some dollars?
Right.
And it's just, in the end, you think about the U.S. passing around trillions of dollars like it's candy these days.
Right.
Think of how little it would have actually cost to turn Russia into, maybe there always would have been bitterness and resentment, but at the very least to just establish this position of trust and friendliness. No, I mean, the attitude of Russians towards Americans back in the 90s compared to what it is today, it's night and day. I mean, it's astonishing. We misplayed things so badly. I was over there 5 or 6 years ago, and I was on this television program where I was prepared for some of what I was about to hear. I knew there were various theories floating around about Trotsky and various New York bankers and all this other stuff about Trotsky and Wall Street and the Russian Revolution. I was not prepared to hear about the U.S. being to blame for the outbreak of the First World War, the U.S. being to blame for the murder of the Romanov family and dynasty and Grand Duke, all the rest of it. Yeah. And then somehow the most amazing thing was that because some of the gold that the Bolsheviks looted, I wrote a whole book about that too, but that some of this gold that was looted and later laundered in places like Stockholm to pay for weapons imports, they would melt it down and remove the old Tsarist Russian insignia, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to sell it in Paris, London, or New York, because it was seen as looted property, basically. Right. Because once they had it melted down, a lot of it ended up in New York. We were to blame for that too. So somehow we had stolen the gold from Russia, the gold that the Bolsheviks themselves stole, and then melted down to pay for weapons to shoot the Russian people. Somehow we've misplayed things so badly with Russia over the last 30 years that now the U.S. is being blamed for that. And obviously some of this it's a weird combination of this new Russian revanchism blended together with the old communist paranoia. Right. But I do think that the Americans or the U.S. foreign policy has played a role in this. I mean, if you look at it in the broadest sense, you look back to 1991 with China crushes demonstrators violently in Tiananmen Square. So China says we're going to remain communist and we're going to kill the people if we have to. So we reward China by showering them with trade concessions and investment and turning China into something like of an economic superpower with our help. Russia says, actually, we're trying to surrender the Cold War. And so we decided to turn them into an enemy. It's so perverse and backwards. It is. Maybe every step in the chain might have made a certain sense at the time to the policymakers, but if you look at all of it together, it's just deeply perverse. Yeah, it really is. I think another kind of weird, counterintuitive move, you touched on it in your Stalin's War book, but also here in this book, is the incredible amount of materiel, supplies, vehicles, weapons that we poured into the Soviet Union in World War II. Certainly they provided the bodies, they provided the soldiers, but all the equipment, materiel, trucks, weapons, it's astounding. And somehow that's airbrushed out of history as well. I guess, Marx's famous line about keep people from their history and they are easily controlled. That's the wonderful advantage of your book, is that you bring up things that they're not usually mentioned. They're just kind of airbrushed out of the story. Right. Well, in some ways, the grandest version of that, or example you cite from the Second World War with Lend-Lease is, I mean, in retrospect, it's pretty obvious, even though for some reason most Americans don't know about it, were never told about it. But you could see all kinds of examples if you look into history. Part of me is very sympathetic to the skeptical line of critics of U.S. foreign policy interventionism, that the U.S. should mind its own business. Okay, well, Great. So let's say we try to mind our own business. Okay, it's one thing to say maybe we shouldn't be, let's say, going to war or even proxy wars with communists. Like, depending on the war, I may or may not agree or disagree depending on what we're talking about. But it's not just that the U.S. was getting involved. In many, many cases, it's almost beginning to look like a pattern. We were actively supporting communists. That's what's so strange about all this, right? It's not that we're not taking sides. It's that we're actually supporting the communists. In the case of China, it's a little more mixed, but effectively by cutting off Chiang Kai-shek and making all kind of weapons deliveries conditional on him cooperating with Mao, his mortal enemy, who's fighting a civil war with him. It's just so bizarre that we effectively do take sides. Or in the case of Yugoslavia, this is more Churchill than the U.S. The U.S. ends up playing a very small role there. And I made a lot of people upset because there's this whole kind of almost cult of Churchill in some circles is quite sacred. And, there are many things Churchill has said and done that I'm quite admiring of. But when it came to Yugoslavia, I'm sorry not to put too fine a point on it, but he was absolutely played. Britain didn't just pull the rug out from under their own client, that is Mihailovich, the Chetniks. They're hosting the Yugoslav royal government in exile in London. They are hosting them. Mihailovich is fighting for the government that Churchill's government is hosting in London. Churchill not only cuts him off, but throws all of his support to the communists in Yugoslavia. And not just all of his support, they end up getting 10 to 20 to 100 plus times more weapons than Churchill sent to his own clients. Or you could even look at these strange examples in the Cold War. What role did the U.S. play in Castro coming to power? They cut off their own client. They helped Castro. Again, some of this through back channels is not all official, but Castro absolutely got his arms from the United States. He got financial support. Again and again, we see this. Sometimes it's just a matter of trading, I suppose, like opening up China, or under Stalin in the 30s, where these U.S. firms are doing business with the Soviet government or literally helping. I mean, this is the most amazing thing about the Stalin period when you look back at it. These people who maybe object and they say, well, today's China does not fulfill, again, the definition of a country where the government owns all of the means of production. That was never entirely true, even in the Soviet Union at the height of Stalinism or in China at the height of Mao. In the early to mid-1930s, it's not just there were private firms operating in the Soviet Union, it's that they were actually doing high-profile projects. They were helping Stalin to build massive factories and metallurgical facilities and hydroelectric dams. Almost the entire city of Magnitogorsk was planned and built according to specifications based on the U.S. steel facility of the, was it the McKee Corporation of Gary, Indiana. I think they're actually based in Ohio, but it was based on the work they did in Gary, Indiana, or the Wheat King of Montana, who designed the Soviet Kolkhoz, or state collective farm. It's kind of amazing when you realize that we helped them build communism. So that it's hardly a matter of isolating, or even people used to say the kind of anti-communist, that we were paranoid about communism or something. Well, it's a strange way of showing it. If the U.S. is actually helping them to build it, or in the case of China more recently, helping them to use our search engines and other IT tech in order to surveil and control their own population. We were helping them do it. I mean, it's strange. It's kind of perverse, but that's what the record shows.
Sean, you've written a fantastic book, and for those of you out there watching this podcast or listening to it on one of the platforms, it's To Overthrow the World. It's the rise, fall, and rise of communism, and we are facing with and dealing with it today. Maybe just a different flavor, a different brand, a different morphed situation. This is not Lenin and the Russian Revolution, but we have our own version of it today. Whether it's COVID lockdowns that are remarkably Chinese in their aspect and nature and enforcement. But it's a fantastic book. I highly recommend it. Sean, I'm going to give you the closing word. If there's something, if somebody's curious or they're interested, what's the hook? What's the takeaway that you'd like people to kind of noodle around in their head and think about if they're going to pick up your book?
Well, I just think they should be reminded. I think the reason I study history is ultimately to illuminate the present. And if you're going to look at the history of something like China's Cultural Revolution, or the history of KGB or Stasi or Securitate surveillance policy or censorship, I think that unfortunately some of this is going to start to seem eerily familiar from our own lives today. Talk about party lines, talk about the death or collapse or disappearance of privacy, how much more difficult it is to speak freely. These are once bedrock concepts: the freedom of speech, the freedom of assembly, the freedom of the press. I think they are all in mortal peril in the United States and the United Kingdom, across the West today. And I do think that in the end we all have to be vigilant, and I think we have to fight for and defend our freedoms. So I've just done my own small part maybe in trying to teach people about the history, I think, so that they can better understand the present that they're living through.
I agree with you wholeheartedly, and I strongly endorse the book, To Overthrow the World. The author, who's joined us now for the last few minutes to talk about it, is Sean McMeekin, who's an extraordinary historian with a whole bunch of good books. I encourage you to read all of them. But this is his latest. And Sean McMeekin is a professor of history at Bard College, and we thank him very much for his time. Thank you, Sean.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me on. It was a great pleasure.
Thank you. I'm Chris Farrell on Watch.